You are looking at a photograph that should not exist. 11 men sitting on a steel beam, 800 feet above New York City, eating lunch, laughing, with nothing beneath their boots but open air. No ropes, no harnesses, no net. This is not a stunt. This was Tuesday. And by the end of this video, you will understand exactly how men did this, why they had no choice, and why so many of them never made it home. By 1929, the skyline of New York was rising faster than anyone could have imagined 10 years earlier. The city was in a race, quietly at first, and then openly, to build the tallest building on Earth. 40 Wall Street, the Chrysler Building, and eventually the Empire State Building, were all clawing upward at the same time, sometimes only blocks apart. Each crew watching the others rise, floor by floor. Each set of architects revising their plans in secret to add just a few more feet at the top. Steel framing that once took a year to erect was now going up at a pace of nearly 1 floor per day. Nobody had ever built this fast, this high, before, and the men doing the actual work, the ones standing on the naked steel skeleton before a single wall, existed, were called ironworkers. Though the newspapers of the time preferred a more dramatic name, they called them the Sky Boys. Understand what these men were actually doing. A skyscraper under construction is not a building yet. It is a steel skeleton, columns and beams bolted and riveted together, open on every side, with the wind cutting straight through it, from 100 floors above the street. The ironworkers who connected that skeleton. The men whose job was to catch a swinging steel beam lowered by a crane and guide it into position, then walk out onto that beam while it was still loose, still shifting. Still, nothing more than a few inches of steel between them and a fall of over 70 stories, worked without any fall protection whatsoever. Not because the technology of a harness and a line was unknown. Ropes existed. Pulleys existed. The problem was the work itself. A connector had to move fast, balance perfectly, and use both hands freely to catch and guide steel that weighed thousands of pounds while it swayed on a crane cable in the wind, sometimes swinging in an arc of several feet with every gust. A rope tethered to a beam that had not yet been secured was not safety. It was often considered a liability, something that could catch, twist, and pull a man off balance at exactly the wrong moment, or tangle around a swinging beam and drag a man with it. So the culture of the trade, hardened over decades of bridge building before skyscrapers even existed, was built on precision and balance rather than restraint. If you needed a rope to keep you on the beam, the ironworkers said, you did not belong on the beam at all. The men who came to define this work, and who terrified and fascinated the public in equal measure, were the Mohawk ironworkers from Conowake, a Mohawk community near Montreal. Their connection to high steel began almost by accident, decades earlier, when a company building a cantilever railway bridge across the St. Lawrence River hired local Mohawk men for shore work, unloading materials and handling ordinary labor at ground level. Supervisors noticed something unusual. While other laborers grew visibly uneasy on the elevated structure, moving cautiously, gripping rails, some of the Mohawk workers moved across the exposed steel with what onlookers described as complete indifference to the height. Word spread through the trade, and soon Mohawk ironworkers from Conowake were being recruited specifically for high steel work on bridges and, later, on the first generation of true skyscrapers in New York and Chicago. By the 1920s and 30s, entire crews from Conowake would travel down to Manhattan for the working season, some living together in a section of Brooklyn that came to be known informally as downtown Conowake, and returning home by train when the job was finished, only to be recruited again for the next tower rising somewhere else in the country. It is important to be precise about something here, because it gets exaggerated constantly. These men were not fearless in some mystical sense. Ironworkers of every background, Mohawk and otherwise, who worked high steel, described the same thing again and again in later interviews. Intense focus, a kind of controlled calm that had to be trained into the body through years of practice, not a lack of fear. What set the experienced high steel worker apart was not an absence of danger sense, but the discipline to keep that sense from turning into hesitation. Hesitation on a 6-inch wide beam, 800 feet up, in wind, was often more dangerous than confidence. A man who froze, who suddenly looked down and registered the drop, in a moment of doubt, was far more likely to lose his balance than a man who kept moving with steady, practiced rhythm. This is why so many veteran ironworkers insisted new apprentices learn on lower steel first, sometimes spending an entire first season working no higher than the second or third floor, building the muscle memory and mental control before they were ever sent up to the connecting gangs working near the top of a rising tower. A young ironworker who showed the wrong kind of nerves on low steel simply never got the call to go higher. The trade sorted itself, quietly and permanently. The daily reality of the job went far beyond simply walking on beams. Riveting gangs worked in teams of 4, spread across open steel, with a portable coal forge glowing between them, sometimes set up on nothing more than 2 planks laid across adjoining beams. A heater would pull a rivet, glowing orange and close to 2000 degrees, out of the fire with tongs and toss it, sometimes a distance of 20 or 30 feet across open space, to a catcher who caught the red-hot metal in a metal cone or a leather glove and dropped it directly into a hole in the steel before it cooled. A bucker upheld a heavy tool called a dolly bar against the head of the rivet from one side, while a riveter, on the opposite side, hammered it flat and permanent with a pneumatic gun, the impact rattling through the entire steel frame beneath their feet and echoing across the site. A skilled gang could drive several hundred rivets in a single day, and the entire structural integrity of the finished tower depended on every one of those red-hot pieces of steel being caught, seated, and hammered correctly by men standing on beams with no railing, no platform beneath them but the sky, in temperatures that ranged from summer heat that made the exposed steel painful to touch, even through gloves, to winter wind that could freeze exposed skin in minutes and turn every surface into a hazard coated in a thin, invisible layer of ice. Above the connectors and riveting gangs worked another set of specialists, whose job depended entirely on precision timing rather than physical balance. Derrick operators controlled the derricks, the tall steel booms that lifted every piece of structural steel into place, and hoisting engineers stationed at the base of the building relayed signals up through a chain of men because radios were not yet reliable enough for the job. A miscommunication of even a second or two, a beam released before the connector was braced to receive it, or swung a foot too far in the wind, could turn an ordinary lift into a fatal accident in an instant. The entire system worked only because of an unusually rigid discipline around signals and timing, developed and refined over decades of bridge construction before it was ever applied to buildings reaching into the clouds. The Empire State Building, which rose in just over 1 year between 1930 and 1931, remains the clearest example of exactly how fast and how dangerous this work truly was. At its peak, the project employed thousands of workers, and the building climbed at a rate that sometimes reached 4.5 stories in a single week, a pace of construction that has rarely been matched since, even with modern equipment and modern safety standards. Official company records list 5 deaths directly connected to construction, a number the builders were proud to publicize at the time as proof of unusually good safety practice for the era, especially compared to the far higher casualty rates of earlier bridge and skyscraper projects. Independent researchers and labor historians have since suggested the true number may have been higher, since injuries and deaths among subcontracted laborers, particularly those working for smaller contractors on lower floors, were not always fully recorded in the official company ledger. Even taking the lowest official figure, 5 men died building what was, for decades afterward, the tallest structure on the planet, and none of them were wearing anything resembling the fall protection equipment that would become mandatory on American job sites decades later. The image that captured all of this for the public, and that still circulates today, was taken in 1932 during the construction of the RCA building at Rockefeller Center. It shows 11 ironworkers seated in a row on a steel beam, feet dangling, eating lunch, with the entire island of Manhattan spread out beneath them, 69 stories down. For decades, the photograph was treated almost as folklore, a staged publicity image commissioned to promote the building project. And in fact, it likely was arranged for a photographer, rather than caught by pure accident. Part of a promotional campaign for the new complex during the depths of the Great Depression. But the men in it were real ironworkers. The beam was real, the height was real, and there was no trick photography involved. What made the photograph so unsettling to viewers then and now is precisely that nothing about it looks unusual to the men in it. They are relaxed. They are talking. One appears to be lighting a cigarette. Another gestures toward the skyline, as if pointing out a landmark to a friend. For them, this genuinely was simply where the job happened to be that week, and the identities of most of the 11 men in that photograph remain unconfirmed to this day, despite decades of attempts by historians and descendants to positively identify every face. Why did an entire industry accept these risks for so long? Part of the answer is economic. Ironworking paid significantly better than most unskilled labor of the era, and during the 1920s and the hard years of the Great Depression that followed, high steelwork offered rare and steady income to men, including many Mohawk workers, who had far fewer employment options available to them elsewhere because of the discrimination they faced in other trades. Part of the answer is cultural. A trade, built around masculine pride in skill and nerve, did not easily embrace equipment that could be seen, fairly or not, as an admission of weakness, and any man who visibly hesitated on the steel risked losing the respect of his entire crew, respect that determined whether he would be picked for future jobs at all. And part of the answer is simply that regulation had not caught up with the technology of the built environment. Formal fall protection standards requiring harnesses and guardrails on structural steelwork would not become a serious legal requirement in the United States until regulatory bodies established under the Occupational Safety and Health Act began enforcing rules decades later, well into the second half of the 20th century. Before that point, safety on high steel depended almost entirely on the individual skill of the worker, the internal culture of the crew, and, when it existed at all, whatever informal precautions a particular contractor chose to enforce on a given job site, which varied enormously from one company to the next. It took the deaths of hundreds of men across the entire skyscraper era, spread out over decades, and largely unrecorded in any single unified count, before American labor law finally caught up with the risks these workers had accepted as simply part of the job. Even after basic safety nets began appearing on some job sites in the 1930s, largely as a response to public pressure following a string of well-publicized falls, full harness and lanyard requirements for structural connectors did not become standard practice until far later in the 20th century, and even then, older ironworkers on many crews resisted them for years, arguing that the equipment was clumsy, restrictive, and more likely to cause an accident than prevent one on fast-moving connecting work. It was only as building codes, insurance requirements, and federal enforcement all tightened together, decades after the Empire State Building was finished, that the modern image of the harnessed, tethered construction worker finally became the industry standard it is today. Chicago tells a parallel version of this same story, and it matters because it shows this was never a quirk of one city or one building. Decades before the Empire State Building rose in New York, Chicago's early skyscrapers, built on the marshy ground left behind after the Great Fire of 1871, were already testing the limits of steel frame construction, and the ironworkers who raised them faced the same open beams, the same lack of any fall protection, and the same reliance on nerve and balance rather than equipment. The techniques, the riveting gangs, the rope signals between derrick operators and connectors, all of it traveled back and forth between Chicago and New York, as the same pool of skilled tradesmen followed the work to whichever city was building the tallest tower that year. By the time New York entered its skyscraper race in the late 1920s, the culture of high steel work was already a full generation old, refined on Chicago's earlier towers, and simply scaled up to greater and greater heights. Weather added a layer of danger that had nothing to do with the steel itself. Wind at height behaves differently than wind at street level, arriving in sudden gusts that could catch a man off guard, even when the air felt calm at ground level. And ironworkers learned to read the sky the way sailors did, watching cloud movement and feeling for changes in pressure that warned of gusts before they arrived. Rain turned every beam into a hazard, since wet steel offered almost no traction for a leather boot sole, and many crews simply stopped work entirely during a storm rather than risk it, losing a day's wages rather than a man. Winter brought its own particular threat in the form of black ice, an invisible glaze that could form on a beam overnight and remain undetectable until a boot slipped on it, which is why many gangs developed the habit of running a bare hand across a beam before stepping onto it on any morning near freezing, feeling for a slickness the eye could not always catch in the gray winter light. Falling objects posed almost as much danger as falling men. A dropped rivet, a wrench, a bolt, or a scrap of steel plate could become a lethal projectile by the time it reached the street, from 70 or 80 stories up. And construction sites established strict rules about tool tethering and material staging specifically because of near misses and, in some documented cases, injuries to pedestrians below who had no idea. A building under construction directly overhead could kill them without a single beam ever falling. Barricades, covered walkways, and warning signs around active tower sites in 1920s Manhattan were as much about protecting the public on the sidewalk as they were about protecting the men on the steel, a fact that is easy to forget when the story focuses only on the workers themselves. The physical toll of the trade extended well beyond the dramatic image of a fall. Ironworkers suffered from chronic joint damage after years of absorbing the vibration of pneumatic rivet guns through their hands and arms, hearing loss from a working environment that was constantly loud with hammering steel, and a level of simple physical exhaustion that made late afternoon, when concentration naturally began to slip, one of the most dangerous times of the entire working day, according to those who survived long careers in the trade. Many veteran ironworkers described a kind of accumulated fatigue that had nothing to do with a single accident, but instead wore down a man's margin for error, year after year, until either he retired from high steel voluntarily to work lower, safer jobs, or the trade eventually claimed him the way it had claimed so many before. The men who did this work were not reckless. They were, by necessity, some of the most disciplined manual laborers in American industrial history, operating in an environment that offered no second chances for a genuine mistake. Their tools were their balance, their training, and their trust in the other 3 men on their riveting gang. Nothing more. The buildings that still define the New York skyline today, the Empire State Building, the Chrysler Building, the towers of Rockefeller Center, exist because thousands of men were willing to walk out onto 6 inches of open steel, hundreds of feet above the ground, every single working day, for a wage and for a trade that asked them to treat a task most people cannot even watch from the safety of the sidewalk as simply another day at the office. Many of those same Mohawk families from Conowake continued the trade for generations afterward, their descendants working high steel on towers built decades later, carrying forward a skill and a culture that had been shaped, floor by floor, on the exact same kind of open, unguarded beams described in this video. This history did not simply fade away once safety regulations finally arrived. The trade itself survived, and in many ways, it never really left the families who built it. Ironworker locals in New York and Montreal still maintain direct, documented lineage back to those same 1920s and 30s crews, and it remains common for a Mohawk ironworker today to point to a grandfather or a great-uncle who worked on one of the great towers of that first skyscraper era. When the World Trade Center's Twin Towers rose, decades after the Empire State Building, Mohawk ironworkers from Conowake were once again among the crews on the highest steel. And when those same towers fell in 2001, ironworkers from that same community were among the first skilled tradesmen to volunteer for the dangerous work of cutting apart the wreckage during the recovery effort, a continuity of trade and risk spanning nearly a full century. Museums in New York now preserve tools, photographs, and oral histories from the original skyscraper boom, specifically because so few written records exist from the men themselves, most of whom left no diaries and gave few interviews, treating the work as simply a job rather than history in the making. What is easy to miss, looking back from a modern construction site where a fall of even a few feet without a harness would shut down an entire job, is how quickly this once completely ordinary way of working became almost unimaginable. A single generation separated the ironworkers, eating lunch on an open beam, 800 feet above Manhattan, and the first federal safety inspectors walking construction sites with fall protection checklists in hand. For the men who lived through that transition, the change did not always feel like progress. Many older ironworkers, interviewed later in life, spoke with genuine pride about a trade that demanded total trust in your own body and in the 3 other men on your gang, and viewed the eventual arrival of harnesses, nets, and guardrails with a mixture of relief for the younger workers coming up behind them, and quiet skepticism that any rope or clip could ever fully replace what balance and years of discipline had once provided for free. If a story like this deserves to be remembered, that is exactly what this channel exists to do. Subscribe if you want more of the forgotten, dangerous history behind the things we now take completely for granted.